Welcome to Work Life by Design. I'm your host, Mel Marsden. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable and we no longer need to go to work to work. As a workplace dynamic strategist and the founder of Community, I draw back the curtains on my own business, the clients and projects that we deliver, along with tapping into the knowledge and insights from academics, business leaders and champions of change. I believe that our environments have the power to positively influence our behaviour and performance, inspiring our human potential. Hello and welcome back to today's episode of Work Life by Design. Now today I want to ask you a question. Have you ever stopped to consider what your workplace is actually telling your people is important to you as a business? Because what I think I see so often is that organisations fail to understand the impact that their actual physical environment is having on what they communicate to their people. And one really good example of this that I share in my book is that I was speaking with a client and she was sharing with me how her workplace was detrimentally impacting on their organisation because it was not supporting the behaviours that the staff were being told were important. So in this particular organisation, they wanted to see more collaboration, but their environment spatial cues were actively saying the opposite to that. So there was nowhere to actually collaborate. So we're in an organisation that wants to value collaboration, are saying that collaboration is important, but there were no spaces to actually facilitate that collaboration. The office was actually quite heavily segregated and segmented, which means that you're often going to see silos starting to occur. And it was really difficult for individuals within the business to actually strike up a conversation and get into that collaborative state without actually going out and sending out a meeting invite and pre-organising something. So I want you to start thinking about what is your organisation telling your people is important, and then how is your physical workplace actually enabling that behaviour to happen? Now, the way that this all comes together is that the design of our environment influences our behaviours, either consciously or unconsciously, depending on the environment. So we can actively go out and design a space that will start to lead our people to behave in a particular way, or we might have just put together a workplace and we are unconsciously creating that behaviour. So in our businesses, our behaviours are actually the physical actions that we see that are communicating a value. So a value is then what is important to the organisation. So if we start at the top level and we understand what our values are, we then want to see people behaving in a particular way to know that they are then aligning with those values and therefore engaging behaviour that's positive towards the impact that we want to make and what is important for the organisation. So if we're going to go and say that collaboration is something that is important to our organisation, but then our workplace environment doesn't actually enable that to happen, then we're starting to confuse people. We're asking them to behave in a particular way, but then we're not enabling that behaviour to actually be performed. We're starting to send mixed messages to our people. And so there are three ways that we start to see these messages being communicated through the design of our physical environments. And the first one is flow, the way that a space is laid out and how it starts to guide a sequence of activities. The second one is the zoning, so the arrangement and proximity of different spaces. And the third one is the spaces themselves, so the variety of furniture types and styles that we start to see within our spaces. Now, let's dive into flow and understand that in a little bit more detail. So flow is really that sequencing of spaces and how we guide our days and how it influences what we do and when we do it. It can also reinforce and inspire workplace rituals and routines. And these are really essential to establishing rhythms in our organisations. So if we think about that more broadly, think about the way that you actually engage someone in your workplace. What is the first space that they enter when they come into the workplace? What are the activities that they are doing there? Are they coming into a cafe environment where they're grabbing their coffee and they're having a social conversation with their colleagues? Or are they coming straight in and getting directly into the work environment? That sequencing and that flow is what is going to then start to communicate to your employees at the very first interaction that they're having with your workspace about what is important. So again, if we go back to the example of collaboration being important, if we're taking someone straight in and they're walking straight into their desk and sitting down and getting stuck into the day, as opposed to the space that's coming in and they're engaging in a social conversation over a coffee in a cafe, the space that actually enables that collaboration is the cafe, as opposed to coming in and getting straight stuck into my work. work at the start of the day. So think about the way that those activities are being programmed. Now, I mentioned routines and rituals within our organizations as well. And these could be simple things like Monday morning meetings. It could be Wednesday lunches. It could be the fact that we celebrate birthdays. All of these things create meaning in our work days and our work lives. And so our spaces then can start to reinforce that, effectively becoming rhythms and patterns of how we then move throughout our day. So if we all get together at morning tea time and we have a conversation over a cup of coffee, all of those things start to come together to help us influence the way that we move throughout the day and the sequence of activities that we do.
What do our workplaces look like when we no longer need to go to work? As organisations navigate a new frontier, struggling to work out what's next in today's hybrid and distributed world, how can we leverage one of our greatest assets, our workplace? My book, The Next Workplace, Designing Dynamic Environments that Inspire Human Potential, will show you how to leverage your workplace to attract and retain talent, increase employee engagement, and elevate employee experience, plus deliver bottom-line returns on your investment. The Next Workplace is the ultimate playbook. It will inspire your thinking, show you how to unlock the data in your business, provide you with the resources to build your business case with confidence, and reveal the proven frameworks and practical tools to align, enable, and inspire the human potential within your organisation. So, to grab your copy and begin to reimagine your next workplace, head over to my website, melissamarsden.com.au/book.
The next way that we can start to influence behaviour is through zoning. Now, zoning is the co-location of spaces, and it's really critical in terms of guiding behaviour, because when we start to think about how we cluster activities together, so if we think about the type of energy that we bring to different activities, so if I'm needing to write a report or I'm needing to do some really concentrated work, I'm going to need to bring a high level of mental energy to that activity. I'm most likely going to need a space that's very individual, somewhere I can focus, somewhere I can concentrate. That type of space is very, very different to the type of space that I'm going to need to engage in a collaborative brainstorming exercise. I'm probably going to need to have a much broader open space. There's going to be much more opportunity for other people to join in because those brainstorming activities are not a solo endeavor. They're usually done in groups. We're going to probably be making a lot of noise because we're going to be having active conversations in there. And we're probably going to want to actually interact with a whiteboard or a screen to be able to communicate our ideas. Those two activities, just in contrast, have very different energies that we bring to them. They have very different requirements for the type of work that we need to do. And what I've seen is when we have put those quiet, concentrated spaces right next to those collaboration spaces, again, we're sending those mixed messages to our people about what is the type of work that we need to be doing here and what is acceptable behaviour in this space. So thinking about how we plan those out and ideally keeping them very, very separated so that people can then actually engage more effectively in each of those particular types of activities. The other thing that's really important to think about here when we start to look at zoning is the ratio of those spaces. So when I talk about ratio, I'm thinking about how many quiet spaces am I putting into our workplace environment versus how many collaborative spaces am I putting into that same space? Now, the reason we need to look at that is because if we are an organisation that values collaboration, but let's say we've only got one space that we can collaborate in, but we've got 8 quiet rooms and spaces where we encourage people to go and do quiet, concentrated work, again, we are sending mixed messages to our people because we are saying that we value collaboration. That's what we're actively telling people, but we are then showing them that we value individual, quiet, concentrated work because that is the number of spaces that we are providing to people in terms of how we then want them to actually perform their work. So that's something else to think about in terms of what we want people to actively do in their behaviour within our work environment, and then how are we enabling and supporting that with the quantity and the ratio of those spaces that we are then actually providing. Now, the final one that I mentioned is our spaces. Now, our spaces are really defined by the type and style of work settings that are within them. Again, I go back to those collaborative versus very focused types of work environments. If we're thinking about those focused spaces, we're probably thinking about a space that is very individual. There's probably lots of soft textures because we want sound absorption and acoustics. We probably want lower levels of ceilings. We've got all of these tactile things and these spatial parameters that sit around us that start to indicate communicate to us that this is somewhere that I go and I work by myself. It is quiet and it gives me the ability to concentrate. Conversely, if I go into a space and there's a high table, it's designed for 6 to 8 people, there's a number of bar stools around it, it's a very open space, the ceilings are quite high, there's tools there for me to be able to use a screen, and there's whiteboards, that is then communicating a very different style of activity to me. And those mental energies that I'm going to bring to those spaces are influenced by that. So when we have high ceilings, what we experience is called the cathedral effect, where everything is possible. And what we start to do is start to see that happening. Conversely, lower ceilings start to make us think more deeply, and they focus our attention downwards and inwards towards the problem that we're trying to solve. So there are a number of different spatial cues that we can give people to influence and guide the type of behaviour that we want to see within our work environments. So what I encourage you to do is really think about, how is your workplace environment influencing the way that people behave? How is it guiding that behavior? How is it starting to present those cues to people about what is the type of work that we want you doing when you're actually physically in our work environment? Do we want you collaborating? Do we want you working in very individual, concentrative ways? Do we want a mix of both? What does that ratio look like? What does that mix look like? So they're all the ways that we can start to think about how our behavior is being guided by our physical workplace environment. Now, I go through this in a lot more detail in my book, and I start to talk about how we can start to cluster those zones. What are the types of spaces that we should be putting together? Where should they be separated and put apart? What are the types of activities that we want to be seeing if we think about that flow? Like, how do we actually move through a space, moving from those very noisy, robust, outgoing spaces to those very insular, quiet and concentrated spaces? So that's just a bit of food for thought for today. If you want to dive in a bit more, go and grab a copy of my book, and it actually explains all of this in far more detail so that you can start to take some of these concepts and apply it to your work environment. Until next week, I look forward to speaking to you then.